there is that risk of pushing parents to teach their kids things that they're not hardwired to learn that at that age. So they take longer and it takes time away from what they are actually hardwired to learn in this specific context.
Bonjour! Welcome to Wide Walls, a podcast where inspiring educators, researchers, designers, and innovators share their personal journey and their vision for creating better learning experiences for children. My name is Mathilde. I am a product manager and learning experience designer, and I am passionate about the role of design and technology in education and learning, and the humans behind it. If you find this episode insightful, share it with your friends and colleagues and give us some stars on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you very much for your support and for being part of the conversation. And now, let's welcome our guest. Welcome everyone. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Mathilde Cerioli on the show. Mathilde owns a PhD in cognitive neurosciences from the University of Montreal with a focus on cognitive training for adolescents. After a few years conducting research in neuroscience, she embraced the world of entrepreneurship by co-founding Fly Little Dragon to connect parents with experts in children's development and learning. She is currently the chief scientist at Everyone.ai, a nonprofit advocating for an ethical use of AI for children, and her second entrepreneurial endeavor. Today, we will talk about ethics and AI for children, but first, Mathilde will tell us more about children's developmental stages and share insights on how we should take them into consideration when designing learning products. Mathilde, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you. So I was really looking forward to it, actually.
Yeah, me too. We've already had a lot of conversations, the two of us, and they've always been like super interesting. So can't wait for this one.
Yeah.
But first, before we start, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and the goal is for you to answer the first thing that comes to mind. All right?
Okay, let's do it.
Let's start. Mathilde, where did you grow up?
France, rural France, more cows than inhabitants where I lived.
Nice.
That kind of setting.
And where do you live now?
California in San Jose.
And what was your favorite game as a kid?
Tetris probably, and I really love Tetris, and otherwise I would just crafts. Crafts was the biggest as well. Those.
Love it. And who was your favorite teacher?
It was an old teacher. He was very small. He was a guy, and he was my French teacher, probably in 7th grade. And he was very strict, not really fun, expected a lot of us, but was very clear in the way he taught stuff. And he was not the kind to praise. So whenever I would say something remotely positive about your work, it had a lot of value. And that's really where I learned how much I liked to write, because he was doing a lot of writing exercise with us and really like teaching us how to write well. So even like I still remember the kind of subject you would have, like you would have to write a whole essay on something, and you were allowed to say the word 5 times, and all the rest of the time you had to find metaphors to refer to that. So then you learn, okay, like when I write, I should not repeat the same words. So it was really, and I think that's really where I learned to love words. So I would say like he was not a nice, kind, warm teacher, but I really loved what I learned with him. And you could see that he was really passionate about his subject, and I think that really like showed through.
That's very interesting. Yeah. And talking about school, what is one thing that all kids should learn at school?
Right now or back in our day? Because I think it's very different.
Oh, I'd love to hear your answer for both then.
I think in our day it was like really more like probably like being organized, rule following. I think it was more important for us, and maybe also like there's a French side to that. And I think for now, I think critical thinking is going to be really key of being able to really question what you see, what you hear, and really be able to go to the root of knowledge every time to really know what is a good source and what is not. I think it is going to be more essential than ever.
Yeah. And what is one thing that all adults should learn at work?
Critical thinking. I believe that we haven't been raised in a world where truths want truths, and now it's like it's much harder to know what is true and what isn't, and there's so much information that it's really hard to really tread water with that. So I think it's more essential for adults as well.
Hmm, nice. And what is a skill you're the most proud of?
That I have.
Mm-hmm.
That's a. I would say creativity.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important, and that's something that I try to cultivate, and that I think you need no matter what is your job or your position, or what you like to do outside of it.
Mm-hmm. And what is the creation that you're the most proud of? Something you made.
I would say my kids. Like that's yeah. I think you can't beat that. So yeah, I would say that.
Yeah, you're the second person to say that, so that works.
Once you've had kids, like I hope it is actually.
um, what is the latest thing you did for work?
Like today, I'm still working on the white paper, so reading articles, like just a
Right,
lot of reading going on,
got it.
which is the part I.
Yeah. And the latest thing you did to relax?
Yeah, spending time with friends this weekend and doing crafts with kids is both things that do relax me. And
Mhm.
cooking, like chopping vegetable in very tiny pieces. It's very soothing to me in some weird ways.
Yeah, it is. It is. And the last question: what app do you use the most?
Oh, Safari actually, because I was looking at my screen time and it's Safari, followed way too close by Instagram, which I'm working on it.
Got it. Thank you. We appreciate your answers. You mentioned the white paper. We're probably going to talk about it a little later in the podcast. That's related to your work with everyone.ai. Before we start our conversation, I would love to hear from you. How do you feel when you reflect on your whole journey from where you started to where you are now?
I would say I'm pleasantly surprised because it's like from France, I did not end thinking of ending up in California. And really, like, for me, like I would say my journey started. I remember when I was 11 and I was like, my parents were listening to the radio and I heard a psychologist come out and I didn't know what it was. And he said, like, basically, his job was to help people feel better on the inside. And I don't know, I was 11 in the back of the car, and I was like, why would anyone want to do any other job than that? And so that was really like what got me into psychology. That's why I went for my master's and then my PhD. And that's also when I progressively fell in love with the research part of it. Because at first it did not seem really fun and engaging the way it was taught during my master's. But when I went to Canada, I was lucky to work with Myriam Beauchamp, who's a brilliant professor, a brilliant human being as well, and who really showed me like the creative, fun, and yeah, like when I say creative, like in how you design an experience, how you look for things, like, and that part really appealed to me. So yeah, that's how I got into that.
And would you say that your goal or like the intent of your work is still to make people feel better inside?
I think so, and yeah, it took a different forms because I used to do a lot of more clinical work, which I don't do enough anymore. But there's only so many hours in a day. But I think it's still the same. I think for now it's more like how do we make sure people feel better and that they have choices in their everyday life, in their activity that keep them in a good mental and physical space.
Hmm, yeah. And on your LinkedIn profile, I read something very interesting. You said that I really wanted to ask you. So you said, when I was asked as a child what I wanted to do when I grew up, my answer was simple: play. And so I was wondering, how did that concept of play kind of guide that journey?
I really think it hasn't changed. I think part of it is I have ADHD. So to be able to do anything, it has to be fun. It has to be engaging. Otherwise, I lose interest and I move on. So I think it guided a lot of my choices and why I wanted to play. That's why I wanted to work with kids. It's because they're so much better than adults at being fun and and playing. And I remember like seeing one of the child that I was working with when I was doing cognitive assessment. So we had done like 3 hours of cognitive assessments and it can be pretty heavy. He had ADHD, so it's a lot of mental work. And at the end, he was like, "What's the name of your job? I want to do that when I'm old because you're just playing all day." And I was like, "Okay, I'm doing it right. It feels light for them." I still pretty much approach it this way. And after that, working with edtech, because I've been doing consulting with edtech and video game company, it's still really much the approach of how do you find a balance between playing and learning and having play remain a positive experience. Because I was thinking of that, and when you go to the definition of play, it's really about having an activity for enjoyment and recreation purposes rather than practical purpose or seriousness. And what I'm seeing a lot, and that's also why I'm doing that with our nonprofit right now, is that I'm kind of sometimes concerned like, are we moving to play is now like done for serious and practical purposes? And we're kind of losing the aspect of no, it should kind of be pointless to begin with. And it can serve a purpose, but it's not done to serve a purpose. And I'm still really very much in the work I do in consulting or with a nonprofit, trying to keep that in mind and to keep children having that space to play.
Interesting. So you'll look at play as kind of something you can eventually inject into, if you want to make activities that have a purpose, more playful or engaging, that's more injecting play within it, but not making play the main objective.
Yeah, I think both can be true. I think it's easier to, even as adults, we should use that more when we have to do something we don't want to do. How do we make it fun and engaging for ourselves? But I think there's the concern for me is like to only have directed play with children, like relying on that too much and not letting them find the way to make something that's not as fun, make it fun but for themselves. I think that's a skill that's really important. Well, on top of all the other skills I already mentioned, that's one that's really important is how do you get yourself to do the things you don't want to do? How do you transform those experiences so that they're fun? And sometimes the edtech business, video games business does that very well for kids. Like it does it, but I think it's a skill that is important to keep for yourself.
Hmm. Right. No, I like that. And kind of leaving that space, especially for children, to not direct play too much and give them the agency of like, if it's really play, then they should be able to bring it in the direction that they like, because
Yeah.
that's inherent to play. Yeah, but that makes sense. And talking
No,
about,
that's good
yeah,
for them. Yeah.
yeah, no, for sure. And talking about children, since that's been a big focus of your research, I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the developmental stages of children and how, children as they grow up go through these different phases, and trying to understand that's a pretty big question, but seeing if we can talk about it a little bit, because it's very important when designing learning tools to understand those concepts. And would love to hear more from you on that.
Yes, that's a good question. From my point of view, from what I see, I feel like there's two common misconceptions that are completely opposite and that coexist. Is either like children are perceived as completely incompetent, unable to do anything on their own, need to be assisted all the time, or they're mini adults. And I think they're neither. I think they're highly capable, but they have some constraints depending on where they are in their development, what is their age, what is their developmental level. So you can't expect a 2 years old to do the same thing as a 10 years old, but you can't expect a 2 years old to do the same thing as a 2.5 years old either. They grow and they change, and so you have to adapt to wherever they are. And I think it's very obvious when they're young. Like if you see a 6 and a 12 months old, like one can barely see it, the other might be walking, like you see that they're different. But after they turn 7, their language is good enough to fool us as adults into thinking they're at the same level in some ways. So then we tend to expect sometimes even more than what they can do. And it's very different depending on their age, on how long they can stay on an activity, what kind of reinforcement they need, what is the level of information they can retain and to reason on after that, how impulsive they are, what's their ability to plan ahead when they're doing an activity. And it evolves. And it evolves throughout life. Like we know that really like the part of the brain that deals with executive functioning matures until 25 to 30 years old. So it's not like okay they turn 7 they speak well. Sometimes they make good reasoning, so they're expected to do that all the time. So I think it's really important to understand precisely where they are when you design tools, because then you can really utilize their strength and make sure that you're using them properly, and then to challenge them properly, because sometimes you see like solutions apps, learning experience that are too easy and that lasts for a long time. So you have something easy for 40 minutes. And what they might actually need at that age, depending on their attention level, is something that's no more than 15 to 20 minutes, but that's more challenging because then there's more learning. So that's why like, and when I work with companies, I like to spend time really understanding what age they are addressing and really thinking with them what should we expect at that age. And sometimes the surprise is like, oh no, like you can be much more like have higher expectation for that, but for that you should really lower your expectations. So there's often a misconception between what they can and cannot do, and I think there's really a need of more collaboration when developing learning experiences with children, and to do that with educators, child development experts, so that you really get a good understanding on both worlds and develop solutions that are really effective.
Hmm. Yeah. I'm curious about the uniformity of these developmental stages. Like if you say, "Oh, I'm developing a solution for children that are 4 to 6 years old." Like how many children are gonna be in that same, let's say 5 to 6, like even a small range. How many children are going to be kind of in a similar phase in their development versus children that will be completely off?
They usually are, and especially the younger, the more similar, because the experiences are not that different, and the more time goes on, the more there's differences. But still, like the way your brain develops, there's a whole part that's really decided by more genetics factor, where okay, this part of the brain is kind of expanding, creating connection, and that's why like when you look at it, like usually children between 18 and 24 months old, like they start acquiring a lot of words, like that's what we call like the vocabulary spurt. And that those factors are kind of set by genetics, but how many words they're going to learn really depends how enriched is the environment, how much you talk to them, how many reads you look with them, how many different people talk to them. So all of those aspects really play a role. And so in that respect, like they develop pretty uniformly, and that's what you see. And I think that's from my background as a neuropsychologist, where you do cognitive assessment. So you have norms for children between 6 and 4 months, like they're very short windows. And you know that 66% of the population is kind of within those. So there is a uniformity in development. So there is, which also means like when you're developing tools and solution, you can actually develop tools that are pretty adapted by age.
Got it. And what are the risks if you develop something that is not um, properly adapted to the developmental stage of children? So of course, one of them is that they're just disengaged and do not learn or do not even use your solution. But are there some risks that could be more like detrimental to them?
Yeah, I think there is. I think like you can have a solution that's just very ineffective but very fun, and then children want to spend so much time on it. And there's only so many hours in a day. So if you spend, and I think anyway, at a young age, any activity you do for several hours and do only this one, I don't think it's ever really good. I think they need like a kind of a proper diet where they do a lot of different things. So I think that's how much time it takes away from other activities. And I think it's also about providing experiences that are not what they need to develop at that age. So, for instance, I see a trend in parenting where parents want their kids to learn some skills very early on. I see 20, 24 months old that know their ABCs. And for that, they spend a lot of time of just going through the ABCs, flashcards, screens. And what is the point of knowing your ABCs at 24 months old? Like at 24 months old, what you're supposed to know is having very rich sensory experience to really work on that sensory integration that is essential at that age. Work on fine motor skills, work on gross motor skills, climbing, falling. So getting all of that part of your development engaged. Deep social interaction, looking at faces, learning to read emotion, understanding what's going on, experimenting, and really like I think sometimes parents like get them into reading, and they should get them into physics. Like what happens if I put the block and it falls? Then what happens if I put two blocks? What happens if it's bigger, if it's smaller? So they should be learning about physics at two. And I think that there is that risk of sometimes pushing parents through many different reasons, pressure to succeed, marketing, to teach their kids things that's they're not hardwired to learn that at that age. So they take longer and it takes time away from what they are actually hardwired to learn in this specific context.
Mm, got it. And those are things that they will struggle, like that would be harder to learn later on because there will be another phase
Yeah.
of their life and development. And yeah.
Same way. I mean, you're French. You're like me. Like you learn to speak English later. So no matter how hard you try, you learn too late. You will always keep an accent. You will never get to the same perfect level of proficiency as an American who learned American from birth, or as a bilingual kid who learned both language from birth. So there are windows of opportunities in your development where like you're hardwired to do that, and then you can still learn, but it's harder and you might not get to the same level of ability.
Yeah. And learning a second language is not as crucial in your life, but kind of having those sensory experiences and those
Yeah,
inputs from the environment, that is much more important at that age.
yeah.
Yeah.
And because especially at a young age, like language is also not about just the language. There's a lot of communication, of emotional learning, of social skills. So it's very different to push a kid to have a second language rather than to learn to read.
Mm.
And they're more hardwired to learn really oral language at a young age than written language. But that goes with later in life. Like we know that there are ages that are more specific for some learnings.
Mm. And I've I've read a lot about how, what you learn in your first 2 years, or first 3, 4, 5 years of life kind of determine a lot of like what your character is gonna be, or your like your how your brain is shaped. I imagine, like, is that something that's true? Is it like that there's that kind of fundamental part of your development?
To some extent, because the brain is kind of preset in some ways, and at the same time, it's very plastic. And that's why when, fortunately, there's accident like strokes or like vehicle motor accidents, there is also a great ability for the brain to kind of reorganize and rewire, but usually it comes at a cost of something that's not as important. Like it's never free, reorganizing. But so there is that aspect of, yeah, we know the first few years are highly important. If you're not exposed to any language at all in your first years of life, which is almost like it's very rare specific case where we've seen that, but then language cannot be acquired, it's kind of like too late. So yeah, we know that how enriched the world is for children is important, but it doesn't mean that okay it's past 6 years and now you're done, like everything is set for you. It's not, but it does play an important and fundamental role in later development for sure.
Mm, thank you. And I'm very curious about now the impact of technology on that development. Because we're in a generation where technology kind of gradually appeared in my life, and I did not have like phones and screens and everything when I was really young. And I'm wondering how that impacts that just these developmental stages for children.
I think that's really what we're trying to do with everyone, is to try
Hmm.
and gather every research and researchers that are interested in that aspect, and to anticipate how it's going to um, be further pushed with more tech, more AI. And there are opportunities and there are risks. Like, it's neither like good or bad. Like, for instance, when you think of access to information, we are about the same age, so we didn't have as much access to information. My kids know things at like 8, 10 that I had. Like, I still don't know. Like, they know more animals than me. I really felt like I knew them all. And now I know, like, oh no, there's no way I will ever know all of them, because it's just much bigger than I thought, and because we learn with smaller pool of information, so there is that potential there of knowing more. But at the same time, and the TV, the shows are of higher quality now. When you look at educational content, there are a lot of good shows out there for kids. The problem is, like, you can always have access to a good show. Whereas for us growing up, like, at some point, like, you were watching TV all morning and then there was nothing left to watch. Like, it was for adults. Like, it was done for the day, and so then you would do something else. But now with streaming, YouTube, like, you can always find a video that kids are going to be interested in. So it can take a lot of time, and that's where I think there's
Mm,
it's important to really think of what is the time that we allow for it.
mm. So again, kind of like take the risk taking away the diversity of experiences that you can have.
Yeah,
Mm,
yeah, and it's really hard when it comes to come back to your question about what is the impact. It's really hard to establish causation, because you can't say, like, okay, like, you know what, we are going to take kids and for 5 years we are going to follow them. Some are going to do like 6 hours of screens and the others 0 hours, and let's see what happens. Like, you can't do that. That's not ethical. That shouldn't be done. So you can't test those hypotheses. What you can see is, what are the correlations we see, and we see that we've increased TV time because there's more experience. Like, there's more research on it. It's been around for longer. So with more increased time spent on screens, you see some impact on global development. But then you just have a correlation. You don't know more, because our kids that are spending more time on screen for a specific reason, because they have delays, they're harder to deal with. There's a need to find them an activity so that parents get a break. Yeah, like, there's so many, like, that's only one of the factors, but there's so many that it's really hard to pinpoint, is it the culprit or not. But we know there are reason to also be more careful, probably,
mm,
and have that approach of, like, let's do things in a balanced way.
mm. And when you mentioned the brain being better wired to acquire different types of knowledge based on what age children are, is the brain of children like wired to to engage with technology? Because I would imagine not, since it's so recent. But I'm wondering if that's something that
I don't think it is wired to, but I think the way content is developed, it's often well developed to play into the way their brain is wired. So
Hmm.
we know they have less self control, they are more impulsive, they look for gratification, and they do poorly with delayed gratification. So that's why you see shows that are fast paced, that move constantly, so that it kind of reattracts their attention constantly. So It's more the opposite way, I think.
Got it. Got it. And so you mentioned the work you're doing with everyone.ai. So were you doing this research to understand better this kind of impacts and how to have a more ethical use of AI in insurance products?
Yeah.
Can you tell us more? And I've been fully disclosure. I've been part of the initial conversations and kind of providing some help and advice when I can on the project. And I'm wondering, can you tell us more about like the genesis of this project?
So first, we're gonna keep like tagging you and pinging you, and like that's gonna be ongoing. Like we're not letting you off the hook. But yeah, the genesis. So you know very well my co-founder. I've worked with Anne Sophie Saray now
Mhm.
for 5 years. Yeah, I think four,
Yeah,
five,
close to
five.
that. Yeah, yeah.
And so I've been doing. I funded Fly Little Dragon with her, but we also did a lot of consulting with edtech companies. And the question of AI was coming up more and more because now to raise capital, you need to find AI in your solution. And so we were really okay, like we need to have an opinion, we need to be able to really assist our clients. So we did a training at Stanford on AI to kind of know what we were talking about from a
Mm.
better understanding and really have more like critical thinking about what we were seeing. And we also got into contact with someone that's been working in AI for years. That's on the engineer side, and also with a speech therapist who's worked with children and who's also really been following the AI trends over the years. So just really started having really informal conversation and kind of enjoying the brainstorm ideas and question of what does it look like when child evolves in a world that's very different, where there's more AI, where there's more personalization, where there's more AI voice assistant, when ed tech products include AI and sometimes might be better developed because of it. And what are all of the opportunities that come with that and all of the risk? And so that's when the idea of like really okay, like we need to know more and to really form opinions on that. So that's how the project for the white paper started. I think the title is Child Development in the AI Era. I should know it by heart. And so we started like really raising that question, and we realized not enough people were asking that question of what happens to child development. And we want to get the answer, like we really want to think about that and anticipate some of the risks so that we create a more mindful approach to ethics in AI, and that we really help create guidelines and regulations so that we don't like turn back in 10 years and think, oh, maybe we shouldn't have done it this way, maybe we should have thought this through. So we are really more into the okay, let's anticipate and really think from what we already know, what we know, what are the products we are going to see, what should and shouldn't be done. Because there's things you don't need to wait for studies and 10 years to look back and be like, yeah, we knew it would not be a good idea, but we didn't have proof. So some things I think you should just approach it with more like precaution when you develop tools.
Mm. Yeah, and that's what happened with social media, right? That there was some people like alerting about it kind of at the beginning, and it did not
Yeah,
really resonate.
exactly. And I think when you look at I think social media, and it's a hot topic right now. Like
Hmm.
we've seen a lot in India, but there's a few elements. So when you look at a teenager's brain, they are pretty vulnerable to those kind of things because they are at the edge. We know there's like an insynchrony in the way their brain develop. Where first what develop is the rewarding system. Like they look for reward, they look for instant gratification more, even more than kids, and that's not where like the and a bit later, so there's a delay in the development. That's where like the impulsivity kind of reduces, so their ability to inhibit behaviors happen a bit later. So that's why like they crave the rewards. And it's also an age where like social skills take more and more space, where it becomes more and more like fine in the, like there's a fine tuning, if you want, like in social skills. So it creates kind of a vulnerable environment if you think about it with social media. So there's really a way of like thinking of how do we develop, like if we were to start over, like how do we develop social media to kind of help adolescents develop better social skills and to not fall into the trap of getting instant gratification in what they do, but like to learn more progressively. And so those are elements that if we try and anticipate, we might be able to create better solution. That
Mm,
being said, when you go back to social media right now, because we see a lot of strong opinions around it, and I think about, is it why there is a mental health crisis, is it not, like that's kind of a debate right now. And I think when you really look at what we know from literature on mental health and social media, it is very difficult. It's not one because it's the other. We know that adolescents, that's kind of the consensus there is right now, is that adolescents who are more depressive are more prone to having problematic use, overuse of social media. And that in turns doesn't help the depression,
mm,
but there is already depressive affects. And then you could think, yeah, then it made it worse, but you don't know what would be the alternative. That's what you contest. Like, okay, let's say there's no social media, that adolescent with depressive affect, what would they have done? Would they have engaged in other problematic use of something else and made their condition worse? Or without social media, they would have had other resources? Like, that's what you don't know. So you can't really test. So it's important to tread carefully when you
mm,
see association. Association is not causation, and so it's really important to keep that in mind when we are seeing things in the press, and to not take shortcuts, because we also know that to some aspects social media, when it's used for specific amount of time in specific groups, can also help adolescents feel better. So it's
mm.
neither good or bad. It's a very complex matter, and I think that's what we're going to see with tech and kids. It's not going to be good. It's not going to be bad. It's going to be very complex, and it's going to be really hard to leverage risk against potential.
Yeah. Somehow when you were saying, that we can't really compare with the same adolescent, like not using social media, I'm thinking like, but what about like 20 years ago, when there was not, can we compare with what was happening with, adolescent that had like depression at that time? Like what were they, diving into?
The work is very different too. It was not
Yeah.
as fast paced. I'm not sure like school was as competitive. Like there's been so many differences.
Mm,
The socioeconomic level was not the same. There was no, like, the economic crisis wasn't the same. There had not been COVID in the middle of their development. Like, so you're like comparing things that can't really be compared. So that's why like social sciences are so fun, and where you have to be very creative, and why sometimes it can be also very frustrating because you can't get straight answers
yeah.
as easily as you wish.
Yeah. And then we can say like, oh, at my time when I was in school, things were that way.
Or you
Yeah, you can
can
say it's different. Yeah. Probably not gonna help you like win
it might not be right.
yeah.
That's why you need people thinking.
Definitely. And how, because a part of the project is to kind of influence like stakeholders who do create content, solutions, tools for children to make sure that they follow some guidelines and have children's best interests in mind. But what happens when, and that's probably going to happen most of the time, the thing they have to do to respect these ethical guidelines conflict with their business interests. Like,
Yeah, I think that's probably for that we need someone in economics that would be able to find ways to leverage that. But so I work with people in tech, and I feel most of the time, most of them are just really nice people that really want to make a difference. And I think for that, the earlier they know in their development as an tech, what should and shouldn't be done, the easier it is to have very clear guidelines than with investors. Because I think it's really hard if you create a product, make promises to investors, and then realize, oh, we can't do that.
Mm.
But it's too late. You have stakeholders. So then it becomes really hard. So consulting really early on, creating collaboration with people in education, with researcher, with child development specialists is probably a good way to warrant against that. And if it's not at least done for like value purposes, a lot of good products and products that work usually very well, they work with child development experts. So even on a business standpoint, it actually makes sense to do that
Mm.
because then you have a tool that parents feel safe to use and that children enjoy and when parents see learning. So all in all, even on a business standpoint, it actually makes sense to create more collaboration.
Mm.
And I think research could also use having, because I've known both words like research and entrepreneurship, and there's more bridges being built, but I think there could be more for sure. What we learn on one side, and especially when you think of, for instance, edtech products, they're going to be able to have so many data that would inform so much of research on education and learning. So there's also a way that you can create that learning engineering to improve products, to improve development, and to really like create a positive cycle of knowing more and doing better.
Mm. Oh yeah, I love that. Do you have example of tech solutions that you feel do a good job at creating content or providing experiences that are developmentally appropriate and also like successful?
I won't go with names, but yeah, they are that really do their homework, that really come
Mm.
with good intention and that really follow through on those intentions. And there are also apps that I think sometimes don't really know how to do that well. And I think there's a real issue right now where there's no real consensus of rating apps. And where like the first metrics when you talk about edtech is engagement. And engagement is so different than learning, and educational content is very different than learning. So it's not because an app shows you the ABC that it's actually teaching your kid to learn.
Mm.
And they can spend hours on it and not learn much because it's not respecting what we know about learning and what is effective. So I think there's also a shift, and I don't know how to make that happen, but there is a shift that's necessary from the metric of how much a child engages to how much a child learns. Because if you really think of it, it should be the opposite. Like, what is the most a kid can learn in the shortest time should be what is like a great educational learning experience. And that's not what we're looking at right now. Actually, when you look, there's a study that was really interested, and this took like the most 100 educated downloaded apps on the Apple Store, and they like analyzed them, and they showed that over half exhibit very low quality design in their development, and
Mm.
they're the most ones. So there's a need to really develop more complex experiences for kids that lead to more learning.
Yeah. And you mentioned the idea of we want kids or any learners, in fact, even ourselves, to learn as fast as possible, which I think also is the opposite of what learning is, because it should not be the objective of like learning takes time and it's supposed to take time, and you will never be able to condense learning in a shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter amount of time. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, there's wasted time and then there's effective learning, because
Hmm.
there's just like apps where you can really spend hours and not learn much. And you could have learned that in, I don't know, a quarter of the time. And then that 75% of time you just gain, you can do other things. You can engage with different activities. So,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely a potential. But there's also a hope that it really can evolve if we're being optimistic, because and that's actually a belief I want to hold on is that through AI we can finally through more digital media, develop solution that kind of are more complex in the learning. Because right now a lot of apps it's just about kind of multiple choice question, and the kids can click as fast as they can, and when you actually see them practice that, often they will just do randomly. And so with AI you can kind of build that. There's more steps that you can't do that anymore, that you can also assess, does the kid know what they learn in a more deeper way than just is it the right or the wrong answer. And so that you can also get to learn where they are at, what are the things they actually did not learn, so that you don't skip to another activity until they've had the proper basis of knowledge. So there is a lot of potential to do better, higher quality products.
Hmm. And what do you think
But
of?
for that,
Yeah.
yeah. But I was gonna say, if the metrics is how much time they spend on the app, then it might be developed in a way like it's just more addictive and it's just more rewarding,
Hmm.
but there's not effective learning. So it can really go both ways. It's just like, and that's why I think like it's important to ask those questions now, so that we kind of shift the way it's being developed and really think of better solutions.
Hmm. And better metrics to better objectives and metrics to track the actual learning outcomes. Yeah. No, I like that. I'm curious about talking about AI and generative AI, which is very interesting in the context of education. The idea of being able to converse with an AI bot in ways that are going to feel more and more and more natural. How do you feel that may impact like children, like young children or children?
Yeah, so I think it is gonna be a big question to answer. I think we don't have that much knowledge on it yet, because like large language model, like they just became more mainstream over the past few months. So it's going to be interesting to see how it develops, but it's also going to be important to really consider children and their development. Like we know that their access to symbolism and understanding what is real and what is not changes and evolves with age. So what they can understand from what is a chatbot, is it real, is it not real, is it a real person, is going to be complex, and we are going to really need to work on understanding that and to conduct more research on this aspect, so that then we get to guidelines that are very specific by age, because the access children should have to it needs to be different by age. But even once they have access to it, what they can do with it, how it's represented, like should it take human form, should it take human form, should it look like an animal, should it speak in full sentences or speak in a specific way, so that children can really realize from the beginning that it's not human form. Like those are like questions I don't have the answers about it, but I really think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's already things done on robotics and children, but a lot more needs to be done to really make sure we create the right regulations and guidelines for children, and to really like safeguard their social, emotional, and affective development.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of another example that you shared with me that was very interesting on understanding, the impact of certain like new technologies on children based on their understanding of what's real, what's not real. And that's very like could be in the news now because we're talking about the Apple Vision Pro release, and that's when you get the example to me of imagining a child putting on a VR set, and there was two examples. There was one like watching like dinosaurs in their living room, right, and not being able to make that distinction between is that real, is that not real, and having that challenge in their like perception of the reality. I think the other one that was even more impactful was imagining that you could relive like a deceased like member of the family, and which feels
Yeah,
possible at some point.
and I think that when you look, like there's already been things developed. So I know for adults of like being able to talk to deceased, or even adults being able to talk to your ex. You're no longer with your ex, but you could create an avatar of your ex and keep conversing with that person. So those are going to be even like really like ethical and moral question, but how a child then knows what death and life is, or is, as a society, our definition of what death is going to evolve. Like uh, we're so much at the beginning of that path that it's really hard to anticipate further than a couple years in the future on those aspects and ethical questions.
Yeah, and I feel that that illustrates very well like how important it is to to talk about it now, and why everyone that AI is such an important project.
We're ahead.
Exactly. So to finish our conversation, I always like to ask this question: if you could design a school around one thing, and can really be anything, what would it be and why?
I think for me it's really about, then I can say that, and that way I can fit everything I want to. And it's about how to be. And what I mean by that is how to connect, how to have deep social skills, social thinking, empathy, how to play, how to have access to metacognition to really observe your thoughts and realize when they make sense and when they don't, and why you're driven to want to believe something more than something else, which relates to critical thinking once again. I think there's going to be a need for digital literacy because, and when you look even at the data, like adolescents really know how to use devices very well, but when you look at what they know about what goes on in their device, it's actually not as effective. I think I actually read that in one of your newsletter.
Hmm.
So shout out to your newsletter. I always learn a lot. And I think another key that's going to be really important is about understanding world cultures and anthropology, because I think there's a very humbling part about anthropology. We tend to want to believe the world we live in and the way we do things is the one way to do things. And when you look at anthropology, you realize that the way you do things is to be adapted to your context, and so it might be right for you within that context, but in a very different context, in a very different kind of society, then things function differently. And so I think having that understanding of so many different views uh, is a rich way to push connection, social skills, and to kind of blend in more with others.
Nice, love it.
So
How to be, and how to be yourself, and how to
to be,
be in the world, right? Yeah, yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you, Mathilde. It was again such an interesting conversation. Where can
always love.
people like find more information about you, about your work?
So on everyone.ai, so our
That's the
website,
website. Yeah.
on LinkedIn, so either on everyone or my profile, and on I have a professional Instagram account, the Playful Brain, that I always say I'm going to post more on. So I might not.
So
Well,
let's follow it to make sure.
no, LinkedIn and the website is a much safer bet to know what's up.
Awesome, got it. All right, thank you, Mathilde.
Thank you so much.